Welcome back to another edition of the Hart2Heart Podcast. And my guest today is Kevin McKernan. He's a returning guest. He has an incredible amount of knowledge on cannabis and psilocybin. Welcome back to the show, Kevin.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate you having me on again. It's always fun catching up.
Yeah, always great to chat with you, Kevin. So before we get started, before we get into the science, can you give the audience a little bit of a brief background about yourself?
Okay, my background has been in genomics since about 94. I started doing sequencing at Emory University as an undergrad, and then got involved in the Human Genome Project after that up in Cambridge, working with Eric Lander on at Whitehead Institute. So we did had that big race with Craig Venter sequencing the human genome, and after that, I spun out a couple companies that focused on building DNA purification tools with magnetic particles and building DNA sequencers. And those eventually got acquired by Beckman Coulter and ABI. And shortly after that, I did some clinical sequencing in epilepsy, which is what turned me on to the whole cannabis field in need of using CBD. And that led me to start this company called Medicinal Genomics, where we currently focus on the sequencing of and building genomic tools for the cannabis field and the psilocybe cubensis field, which is another interesting medicinal organism.
That's awesome. So you're doing things that you're obviously very, very interested in, and then you have, this incredible background to share it. So that's awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to chat with you again for a long time, but I should say, what kind of prompted this podcast to happen was I put something out on Twitter where I indicated that, I don't think THC is helpful for teenagers or for people with schizophrenia. And when I say I don't mean helpful, I mean I think it's dangerous in that regard. And so I got a little bit of a backlash there. Alex Brenson actually retweeted it. So Alex was the guy who I debated on Joe Rogan. But Alex and I have kind of made up since that time, so to speak. And I've followed him a little bit on a Substack with COVID. I thought he's put out some interesting information there. I'm not saying I agree with all of it, but I certainly do, appreciate his points of view. But anyways, coming back to, what happened. So, I put out this tweet about THC and teenagers and not being good for teenagers and schizophrenics. And then a lot of people thought, I completely, changed my stance on cannabis, which is, not at all the case. And even when I was on Joe Rogan with Alex Brenson, I didn't indicate in any way that I think that, THC is, good for teenagers or good for people with schizophrenia. And then Kevin, I know, so much about this topic. And then you kind of, jumped in there too and put your 2 cents in. So, that being said, what were your thoughts on that tweet overall, and what are your thoughts on THC in teenagers and for schizophrenics?
Sure. So
people who are predisposed to schizophrenics.
I think if Alex Berenson applied the same scrutiny he applies to the generation of data during COVID, to the generation of data that has happened in the cannabinoid field, he may come to different conclusions. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the data that's generated for cannabinoids is all funneled through NIDA, which is the National Institute for Drug Abuse. And they have a charter to look for abuse. They don't have a charter to look for benefit. And so many of the same flaws that he has seen in COVID, which is a lot of these government agencies kind of pushing data that directs a narrative. The same thing has been going on with cannabinoids for many, many years, in that they have one side of a narrative that tends to be somewhat in support of abuse as opposed to looking for benefit for these things. So that's my general feel on what I've seen. I love the debate you had with him on Joe Rogan, because I thought that aired the other side of the story, which is that, hey, these things, it's a very complicated and nuanced topic. There isn't a clear, binary, these are good, these are bad for all kids. There are particular kids, I think, that benefit from cannabinoids. And this is actually well documented in epilepsy. Now,
Absolutely.
you weren't saying sick kids. You were saying just recreational use, and that's a different topic. But I do think when you get into the field of neurology, this concept of recreational use and medicinal use gets blurred quite a bit. You have kids with autism, you have kids with ADHD. You've got parents that report that these kids do better on these compounds than they do on Adderall and these other drugs that are considered to be given to kids before school every single day. So it's certainly a complicated topic. Now, I think where I tend to go with this conversation is we've got to look at this from a really personalized manner. It's very hard to make these sort of herd medicine decisions on populations at large for particular drugs. We're doing that a little, I think, way too much of that in COVID and with vaccines. But when we look at the variants that people have found that show predispositions to adverse effects like this, I think they're very telling. There's some great work from Ethan Russo that's come out showing that there are variants in dopamine receptors, in TRP receptors. TRP receptors is a vanilloid receptor that's often associated with caspacin. It's a hot pepper type of effect. That's the receptor that is actually getting triggered from caspacin and hot pepper. Those variants in those receptors have shown people to be predisposed to getting cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. In fact, that's an area that I think Alex should focus on. I think the schizophrenia links he's putting forward are really weak and associative. There's even evidence of CBD actually helping schizophrenics, and many schizophrenics
have an antipsychotic.
Yeah, they report using this to medicate themselves, and they self-report it helps. We don't really know if it does. And so it's difficult to untangle whether their drug-seeking behavior is involved in this, because you see schizophrenics using alcohol, using nicotine, using a host of things. And we don't know if they're trying to treat some symptom or whether it's actually causing their symptoms to get worse. These things are really, really hard to unravel with all the confounders that are in a lot of these studies. There's socioeconomic concerns that people have raised. There's a host of issues with that type of work. So when I bring up those variants, I do that to point out that everyone's, their genomes are different and they're wired differently. And it's hard to say that this is a non-use for all people of a certain age, because I think some of it's going to come down to people that have these genetic predispositions to make them. In fact, the one that's recorded for AKT1 is a good one we'll put some, I think maybe these papers in the show notes, but AKT1 is a variant that's shown people tend to get more paranoia and these I think they call it a psychotic some type of.
And roughly how many people would have that?
That one's actually shockingly common in the population, more common than you would think. I think when mycelium looked at this initially, he was thinking like 9% of the patients who took THC would get paranoia, but that variant's like in 23% of the population. So it doesn't explain everything, but it does show that there's a propensity for some genotypes to actually have worse outcomes with this. Likewise, the dopamine receptor ones I think are really important, because those are always tied into addiction. And if you're familiar with cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, this is happening in people who are chronically using THC and a lot of other drugs.
And for people who don't know what hyperemesis syndrome is, it's basically that they've used cannabis so much where when they don't use it, they get very, very sick and they tend to throw up. And what happens, and I've actually seen patients even come into my office like this. I remember even when I was a resident, where they just have like a hot water bottle like stuck to their stomach, and they find that is what provides them relief.
Yes, yeah, hot showers as well, and they think that's where the TRP receptors are coming in, because those are temperature sensitive receptors. That's
that makes sense. Then I've never put that connection together.
Yeah,
before.
And that's an important one, because when you look at causality with association studies like this, you want to see dose response, and you want to see temporal response, and you want to see if you remove the drug, do things change? And that does happen with CHS. And it's important to actually diagnose this correctly, because it looks very similar to cyclic vomiting syndrome, which is a very different genetic etiology. Usually it's like a mitochondrial disease of some sort, but they'll present in very similar ways. The difference being the ones with CHS, if you stop the cannabis use and if you give them hot baths or hot showers, their symptoms resolve. So that's one of these Bradford Hill tenets of causality, is if you can actually.
And how many people roughly get the hyperemesis syndrome? And obviously that's going to depend upon cannabis usage, but roughly how many people experience that?
That's a good question. It's frequency in the population. I can't recall offhand. It's very rare, but it's a real effect that I think Alex would be much stronger ground pointing out that issue with cannabis, is that there is.
And how many grams a day do you think roughly someone would have to use to kind of work up to a point where they may be putting themselves at risk of that syndrome, of hyperemesis
it's
syndrome?
Generally I've not seen a lot of people get this once they get sensitized to it, just smoking a few times a day will do it. But usually they find themselves where they've been using really high concentration oils in dab pens or these things where the THC levels in there are like 70%. And so they're using those many times a day. And I think what happens is the receptors get down-regulated in some way, where you have to just stop use of these things for them to bounce back. And most people I've spoken to about this say that the sensitivity doesn't really go away in time. Like if they get re-exposed to THC a year later, this starts to occur again for them. So they're pretty much off it for a very long period of time in order for the symptoms to resolve. But I don't know the actual population frequency and exactly what doses are required. It's just a high consistent use seems to be the pattern.
So coming back to what I was chatting about originally at the very beginning, THC in teenagers, THC in people predisposed to schizophrenia. Like I totally agree with you. I use CBD all the time for teenagers, even people who are preteens, and it's very effective for controlling epilepsy, like you said, but also too for controlling mood disorders. Lots of kids with autism benefit from CBD oil. They find that their tics actually decrease overall, and you just kind of see this global overall improvement in their mood and behavior. And so, it does have, like, cannabis, is a very, very complicated plant. There's a lot of cannabinoids, and terpenes in there. So we can't just, talk about just about THC. So, CBD, like I said, is definitely effective for kids for a variety of different reasons. But also too, you mentioned earlier about schizophrenics, and CBD can actually be effective for schizophrenics. It does seem to have this antipsychotic effect, although I think you do have to use
High doses.
pretty high doses to get the desired effect. Like a lot of patients will just use 20, maybe 30 milligrams of CBD, and they usually get sometimes a fairly robust response. Whereas with schizophrenics, they may, they're in the hundreds, 100 milligrams,
Right.
200, even 300 milligrams, which is higher. And then the other issue there, I mean, I think you have to go beyond 300, but again, most of our patients aren't on. There is a slight risk of increase in elevated liver enzymes at that point as
Yes,
well.
yeah.
But
CYP3A4 and 2C19 are they're kind of the grapefruit juice enzyme. So if you have a medicine that has a grapefruit juice warning, you have to just be careful of using those levels of CBD because it can alter the metabolism of other drugs if you're on Eliquis or warfarin or what have you. Yeah.
so in terms of teenagers though, like would you say, Kevin, like THC is a complete no-no, or would you say that, we need to do more research? Or would you say, maybe it's safe if you use it a little bit with CBD, or what are your kind of thoughts
Well,
overall?
I tend to put them as a parent. I tend to look at this problem as what else are they going to be exposed to, right? I would rather have kids using THC than alcohol, and that's kind of the trade-off they're often faced with in like a high school environment. Is that there is alcohol that's everywhere. Kids are using that, and it's far more toxic than THC. In fact, you can find links to schizophrenia with alcohol as well. So I'm
And is it just as strong as with cannabis?
I don't know the relative amounts other than I've seen literature on both, and it's certainly more.
And nicotine as well,
And
right?
yeah,
Tobacco
nicotine
can
was in
also
was in
cause
that
some
list, and
issues.
often the studies looking at this unfortunately can't unravel them because they're often using all of them in the study. But at least if you look at an LD50 and if you look at like a therapeutic index, you can in fact overdose on alcohol, and it's very hard to do that on THC. I mean, I think the therapeutic index is over 1,000, which is the ratio of the LD50 to the effective dose. Alcohol, I think that number's somewhere like 12. So if 3 or 4 beers gets you to your recreational dose, if you 10x that in the same time frame, half the people are going to die. So I find that to be sort of a much more frightening thing as a parent. Likewise, the impacts on, and I would never recommend any kid use these things and get in a car, but kids make these mistakes and do this, and they're far more dangerous behind the wheel on alcohol just due to velocity. They tend to drive faster, whereas the studies on cannabis show that they drive slower, like 9 miles an hour slower. These are done on adults, not in kids, but I think Mark Anderson has some of the work on this. And this, as you know, from a physics standpoint, the energy in a car is the square of the velocity. So if you slow someone down 9 miles an hour, you're slowing down the energy in any kind of car crash tremendously. So it's something that I think is if they're mixed around and they're in social circles, I try to advise children to understand these things. The other thing I try to advise them, if they're ever going to go down the road of looking at cannabinoids and exploring these things, is to make sure they're doing things that are tested. They're not using these pens you get out of gas stations that have no testing on them. They usually have Delta 8 in them. And these cannabinoids, we just don't know what else is in them. They're not tested for heavy metals. They're not tested for pesticides. We don't even know if they're pure. And so those are a whole lottery machine, if you will. I wouldn't advise anyone
So
using
I
those.
think that's a good place to maybe start chatting about vaping, and just so people are aware, again, like my stance right now is that, I don't, prescribe or endorse THC for teenagers or also for, people who are predisposed to schizophrenia.
I
But
think the
I'm
genetic
certainly,
predisposition is
still
important.
looking at the
I think that's
research.
important that you
Yeah.
raise that. That if there's any history in the family, stay away from it. In fact, you should be very careful with any drug use at that stage. But um,
But vaping is such a hot topic. So, I'm really glad that you brought it up because, some people now are saying that, vaping is just as bad as smoking, which, I don't think we can say that. I don't think we have, data on that yet. I know even last time when we chatted, Kevin, we both said that, we don't have enough data to really make a firm opinion, about this particular subject. I'm not sure if you've, teased out any literature over the last couple of years or so, or since we last chatted.
no, I mean, the only literature I've seen on the smoking front is from Donald Tashkin, where they looked at people smoking like 10 joints a day compared to tobacco. And I don't even know how they find people who can smoke 10 joints a day. That to me is mind boggling. But they managed to get them in the
Yeah.
study. And they were looking at COPD, and they didn't find an elevation of COPD with cannabis, but they did with cigarettes. And cigarettes are filtered, and usually the cannabis joints are not. So that was a real puzzler. No one expected that. They thought the cannabis smoke would be dirtier and be more inflammatory. But the thinking is that the anti-inflammatory nature of the cannabinoids is playing a role in lowering COPD, despite the fact that they're getting probably benzylpyrene and all these other pyrolytics in there that aren't good for you. So if there's anything that vaping offers, is there should be less pyrolytics in the smoke, and therefore it should.
So pyrolytics meaning things like
Yeah, when you
benzene
start
or
burning plant matter and paper, you end up with all of these unknown compounds from the fire, from igniting it, and those are harder to classify and harder to understand. But the vaping should be cleaner. Now, should meaning if it's tested product and there's no heavy metals in there, and it's important that they don't just test the oil, but they have to test the oil in the presence of the vape cartridge itself, because the heating elements and the atomizers inside those things can sometimes have metals in them that will reintroduce metals upon putting the oil on them. So it's they're beginning to do this in some states where they're demanding the vape cartridges get. I think Colorado is starting to at least investigate this, where the testing labs will look at the through gas chromatograph and a handful of other analytical chemistry techniques. They'll look at the content of the oil in the cartridge that it's going to be delivered in, so that they can understand if there's anything introduced, like vitamin E acetate was something that became a big mess in the
yeah.
field back in the Valley crisis just before COVID.
Yeah, the vitamin E acetate, that's the one kind of thing that's definitely been brought up as a sure culprit for, deteriorating your lungs and definitely causing some pretty severe lung disease. But is that right now, to your knowledge, Kevin, the only one that we've really identified with regards to vaping that we know is absolutely
Well,
carcinogenic?
we've seen recently is that THC acetate, which is one of these THC compounds that you can derive. There's a big loophole in the hemp regulations, where if you can derive, and I think the DEA is cracking down on this right now, but if you can derive a cannabinoid from CBD, it will fall in the hemp regulations, which require less testing. And so they do is they take CBD and they acid catalyze it into delta 8, and I think in a similar manner they can make THC acetate. THC acetate's one that when you heat it, it will form ketones, which are carcinogenic. So that's another one that we have to get our head around. That's one probably shouldn't be in the marketplace and needs to be.
So delta 8
Delta
is
8. I don't
definitely,
know that it's necessarily. I don't think there's anything wrong with the compound itself when it's pure. I think the fear is that when you acid catalyze CBD, if the CBD source isn't clean, you acid catalyze everything else that's there, all the contaminants, and then those end up in the pen, and we don't know what they really are. So it has to really start from like almost a crystalline CBD, something that's really 99% pure, and then the process of cyclizing that ring needs to be QC'd as well. So there's
and this is where, regulation is like a good thing because, we want these products to go through, the same
yes,
regulation process that other products go through so that, they meet the standards, that they don't have contaminants. Like when we go buy, Advil over the counter, we know that it's not contaminated with
right.
something. I think we should get to a place where when we go buy, CBD or vape cartridges over the counter, we absolutely know for sure that there's no contaminants.
Yeah, there shouldn't be
in
this
there.
expectation of a consumer having a portable gas chromatograph with them to try and sort out what all their drugs are every time they buy them. That gets a little cumbersome and crazy. But
Yeah.
But there are huge loopholes right now where things are ending up in gas station stores, not going through testing labs, and then we don't really know what's in them, and then they create these problems in the marketplace that get blamed on THC, which is a really regulated, tightly regulated market right now. There's the testing that goes into THC products is far more scrupulous than what you get on food, and it should be because you're inhaling it. But it's the companies that are selling through that supply chain are having to put product out that's probably twice the price of the gas station market, if you will. And that's because they're playing by the rules and they're getting penalized for it, having to compete with another party that's kind of a gray market that doesn't have to play by those same rules. So I think testing is very vital in that kids shouldn't just pick up any random vape pen someone's handed them at a party unless they know what the hell it is.
And coming back to, cannabis and alcohol, and, I'm certainly in the camp that I think that, cannabis as a whole is, again, we're not talking about teenagers using high THC or people predisposed to schizophrenia. We're talking about, adults with developed brains. Like, I find overall that, cannabis, would be less harmful than, say, alcohol.
And that doesn't mean we have to
in
condone
general.
use of either. It's just it's hard to
Yeah,
take this approach
I
of
agree.
pure abstinence because I think that doesn't happen. I think what happens when you preach pure abstinence as a parent is the kids lock you out of what they're doing, and then
I
they're on an
agree.
island, they're on their own. They can't learn from you. And you as a parent have decades more experience with these things and can offer kids a hell of a lot of insight on what to avoid and what not to avoid. But I think the moment you put up the
And
abstinence curtain, they shut off.
and I think too that, being abstinent isn't always necessarily like the healthiest thing for someone. I know that can be, somewhat controversial. It's definitely, works for some people. Like, I know Eminem and Russell Brand have,
Right.
they're completely sober, and it seems like it works for them really, really well. But for other people, maybe they're going through some trauma, maybe something, bad has happened recently, and maybe in that instance, using a psychedelic or even using cannabis, technically cannabis is a psychedelic, just very, very weak psychedelic. But, using something like that may actually be beneficial and may actually improve your overall mental health. So I know that, it's kind of, I don't know if it's popular these days, but there's a lot of people talking about, abstinence, like, Andrew Huberman certainly, put out a couple podcasts on cannabis and alcohol. And, he's kind of, very strong opinion that, we should basically zero out everything. And, I certainly respect Andrew Huberman. But I also think that, sometimes, the goal always shouldn't be to, be abstinent or get sober. It should be to, improve the overall patient health and improve their overall mood and their well-being. And sometimes that may include, introducing psychedelics into their routine.
Absolutely. You're bringing up a good point, I think, and when it comes to like sports medicine. I know of a lot of kids that had concussions in playing football, and they can't go anywhere near cannabinoids. Even CBD, they're worried about. And we know a lot of football players that have come in from. We run this CanMed conference every year. It's probably 7 years going now, and a lot of the football players and high contact sport athletes were singing the praises of CBD for this compared to all the other drugs they're given. And there's good literature on this that it's a great lipid soluble antioxidant. It gets to the brain and it limits inflammation and helps with CTE. These kids that are playing football, if they're getting concussions frequently, you don't want them turning to alcohol because they won't get tested for that. They should be thinking
Yeah.
about CBD to help with their head injury. Yet they'll probably be penalized for touching cannabinoids. If any of that CBD has
And
trace
didn't
amounts of THC, they'll pop positive on a test.
And didn't the Israeli soldiers start taking
Oh, did
CBD
they?
before they went into combat? Yeah, this was like 4 or 5 years ago. I saw a report on
Oh,
that.
that's great. Yeah, they're ahead of the curve on
Yeah,
all
a lot.
this.
Yeah, I mean, Israel is actually, kind of the capital of the world for cannabis research. It has been anyway for a long time, and it seems to just keep going that way. But yeah, I mean, CBD does seem to have a protective effect, against concussions, and for people who have post-concussion syndrome, it seems to mitigate a lot of their symptoms. So I'm actually very interested in that field because, as we know, like TBI, traumatic brain injuries, concussion, CTE, it's just kind of, it's blowing up. Like everyone's talking about it all the time now. People are very concerned about it. And we need something to be able to introduce like some type of therapeutic treatment for it, because right now, I mean, if you go to a doctor either for prevention or for post concussion syndrome, they're not really able to offer you much treatment at all. And so I think that if we have any research at all on CBD being helpful, we should really dive into that, because we know so many people are suffering from traumatic brain injuries. And it's not just in sports. It can be like an old lady like falling down the stairs and hitting her head.
Right.
So people get traumatic brain injuries various different ways. It's not just from playing contact sports.
Yeah, I mean, my general sense on these is you see so much literature on the need of the importance of the endocannabinoid system from cradle to grave. So you see it in anandamide is really vital for breastfeeding, right? This is what triggers suckling in children, and so anandamide is the endogenous cannabinoid, if you will, anandamide and 2-HG.
And that's released too after in the runner's high.
That's true, right?
That's one of the things. That's
So they're probably
it's called the bliss molecule.
Yeah, they're anti-inflammatory compounds that probably help drive down inflammation after heavy exercise. But and then you see them in old age as well, where a lot of these elderly ailments are being treated with CBD and other cannabinoids. Even Salk has a very interesting paper on THC dissolving beta amyloid plaques in Alzheimer's. Right, so there seems like there's purpose of them for the elderly. There's obviously they're key in getting feeding going in children, and then we have this kind of puritanical look at this adolescent era. We're like, okay, you can't put anything on their brains during that period of time because they're developing, and so they're off the chart there. And I just like to push back on that a little bit, because I'm not so certain of that data. The data is usually driven with fMRIs. They usually see a change in gray matter, but we don't know if that change in gray matter is actually positive or negative for the person. You can get change in gray matter with drinking as well. So we need more work on this, but I generally see that the cannabinoids are just utterly shunned on that age category, and we don't really do the same thing with alcohol, and we should. Like, if you're going to be honest about this with kids, that one is far more neurotoxic and far more dangerous for them, and it's probably going to put them in compromised positions, making poor decisions and hurting themselves. Yet we have this theme running around that it's so mind altering, it's going to maybe turn you schizophrenic when you're 15 or 16, and I just don't see the evidence there being very strong. It's usually based on data that. It's from agencies that I think Berenson would critique now under his COVID hat, being like, these have all conflicts involved, and they're government agencies that have pharmaceutical funding and all this conflict that if he looked at this data with the same scrutiny he looks at government data on the COVID front, he'd probably come to different conclusions.
Yeah, I'd love to chat, with Alex, about COVID and about cannabis again, but hopefully I'll be able to make that happen.
You gotta get Joe to make the marriage happen again. He'll bring you together.
That'd be fantastic if he could do that, and I think a lot of people would enjoy it too. So I appreciate you saying that, and hopefully that happens in the near future. But one thing I want to ask you about today too, Kevin, is so we talked about CBD, we talked about THC. Obviously it took us up until basically maybe 2014 or 2015 before anybody knew anything besides cannabis other than THC, and then CBD hit the market. Now, and I've always kind of hesitated having this conversation because, it's kind of frustrating when you mention a molecule and people can't access it. But now it seems like, CBG is certainly more available.
Yes.
CBC seems to be more available. CBN seems to be more available. The one that I, wish was available was THCV.
Right.
The reason being because it's supposed to be able to decrease your appetite, and it was actually shown in one randomized control trial in diabetics to lower their overall insulin and and decrease the food intake. So, it seems to be like a miraculous cannabinoid, but unfortunately, again, I don't chat about it too much because it's not commercially available. But CBG and CBN, CBC, particularly CBN and CBG, those two ones are pretty commercially available now. What do you think of those?
Bonnie Goldstein just had a great talk going over each of these at CanMed, and I'll hopefully have the video up for you guys in the next few weeks. So she went through all of these alternate cannabinoids and how they can use. Now, CBG, I thought her presentation on that was fantastic, because she was showing papers that were demonstrating it was like tenfold more potent of an anxiolytic compared to CBD. So for the patients who
Wow.
are maybe using this for schizophrenia or anxiety and they're using 300 milligrams, she was suggesting they could use 30 milligrams and get the same effect. So
Wow.
that's one that that I have a lot of promise on. I think it's an exciting one, and it wasn't one that you really could talk about much years before because we didn't have plants that really produced this in high quantities. One perhaps side effect of these hemp regs that the industry has been fighting is that they have forced people to breed for those instead. So for those who aren't familiar, the DEA has a 0.3% THC limit on hemp, and if you go over that line, they got to burn down the whole crop, and you can lose your farm. It's a really draconian rule, and it's hard to achieve in a green way. In that, in order for you to get your plants to be at 0.3% THC, you basically have to cut them early and waste a tremendous amount of product, because if you grow them to maturity, they'll reach 20% CBD, and they usually have a 20-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC. So they'll pop that number. So what they tend to do is grow them to 8%, and then you get less than 0.3. Now, a trick that you can do, and what the breeders have figured out since these regulations came into place, is you can find plants that have CBD synthase knockouts, mutations there. So they only build up the precursor, which is CBG, and they don't make THC or CBD. And then they can push those to 20% CBG, and now we have great CBG access on the market. The same thing is happening with THCV and CBDV. It's a couple years behind, but they've now figured out how to make those plants so that they produce like 7%, maybe 10% of THCV and CBDV. It comes with some.
So you're thinking that THCV oil is on its way in the
Oh
next
yeah,
couple of
the
years,
only
Kevin?
trick is it tends to be contaminated with just as much THC, and they can usually fractionally distillate this, or they can purify it later. But the flower itself and how it grows natively is you end up right now with a plant that makes about an equal amount of both. Now that's
Okay.
fine for CBD, because CBD and CBDV, those two compounds, there's no regulation that has those things mixed, but it does help if you're growing a THCV cultivar that's predominantly making CBD, like a 20-to-1 ratio. That 1% or that 20-to-1, the one part that's THC, if it's half THCV, then it can sneak through the regulations. And so that's what they've done, is they've brought in the genetics that kind of shorten that side chain on the THC molecule, so it's 3 carbons instead of 5. And when the plant starts making half that and half THC, the CBD plants end up splitting their contaminant with THC to THCV, so they end up getting below the level that way. They've made triploid. Oregon CBD has done great at breeding on this. They've made triploid versions of this, which means they grow to larger size, and they end up being have a little bit more vigor, and they end up being sterile so that they don't have any seeds. And those are just making their way out to farms in the last year or two, and they're starting to grow these now. So you can start to find THCV in some dispensaries. They've now figured out how to grow enough of it.
That's awesome, because it's I think it'd be so helpful for so many people, considering so many people struggle with their weight these days.
It's really important during this whole COVID thing. I mean, you look at all the comorbidities.
I think so too. But one thing, I just want to come back to the CBG for a second, because that was a pretty powerful statement you made, a while ago. That CBG could be 10 times more powerful as an anxiolytic than CBD. What was the mechanism of action that she identified? Was it something similar to CBD?
I think there was one additional serotonin receptor on her slide, but I've got to dig for it and bring it up. But she listed the different receptors that they differentially hit, and
but CBD would primarily act on the 5-HT1A receptor.
Yes,
correct?
So I think it's 5-HT1A, and then there is it's also a COX-2 inhibitor. So it changes.
CBG is
CBD is, and CBDA, and I think CBG also has some COX-2 activity.
So for people listening, that would mean that it would be effective for pain control overall. And I mean, a lot of people find CBD to be effective for pain control. Now, it is generally better for people who have inflammation, and also people who have muscle spasms in particular. That seems to be its very best use. Patients who have MS with really bad muscle spasms, CBD seems to be incredibly effective for that. It's also, again, effective for people who have repetitive injuries like inflammation. So anything with itis in it means inflammation, and CBD is really good for pretty much anything related to inflammation. What it maybe is not quite as good as say THC is for neuropathic pain. So numbness, tingling, sciatica type of pain that shoots down from your bum to your toes, which I've experienced recently, unfortunately. THC is better for that particular pain. But coming back to another cannabinoid, some people have reported that CBN, which is another commercially available cannabinoid, is also helpful for pain control. Have you read any evidence to that, Kevin?
I've seen more on CBN and sleep and
sleep. Yeah, that's the big one where people talk about CBN.
It is, and what is his name? Dedi Meiri, who's from Israel at the Technicon Institute over there. He's been doing some interesting work on CBN, and that he actually thinks there's a couple other trace oxidized cannabinoids that are responsible for it. He's called them go to sleep 1 and go to sleep 2. And they're oxidized, meaning that CBN isn't something the plant makes. It's a breakdown product of THC. But when the plant gets broken down like that, other cannabinoids, rare ones, also get oxidized. And so he's pinned down a few of those that he think are responsible for sleep. And so when you have CBN, it's just a tracer for this other effect that's occurring. But
because when I had Dr. Ethan Russo on, maybe it was last summer or so, he was kind of thinking that CBN was a little bit overrated for sleep, but maybe that's just because it was, the CBN without these
I think so.
Broken down compounds that's kind
of what Dedi was getting at, is that people tend to attribute it to this effect to CBN, but it just has other cannabinoids in there that are oxidized that are doing it. And depending on how they isolate the CBN, they might remove those. And so some people will take CBN and it won't help them sleep, and it could be because they isolated the CBN in a way that maybe lost those other two compounds. But that's very recent finding. I don't even know if his data is out in peer review yet. I think that was just presented at a conference last year, so it's still bleeding edge.
Okay. So Kevin, I know you have a tremendous background in terms of science, and maybe I should have actually got you to say that before we started the podcast, or at the beginning of the podcast. But I do want to ask you about the vaccine. I have not been talking as much about COVID recently, but there was one study that I saw that I put up on my Twitter a couple days ago, and it really caught my attention. And again, I hope none of this research is true, but I think it's important to talk about it instead of just suppressing it. And so the study basically indicated that repeated mRNA vaccinations can potentially induce autoimmune disease and new cancer. New cancer growth, and also myocarditis, which has been teased out quite a bit, and is more, I guess, a mainstream thing. But what are your kind of thoughts on that recent study that showed that the increase in IG4 can lead to all these deleterious effects?
Yeah. So the way I understood that study was that, and there's a couple studies that have pointed at this IgG4 thing that's going on, and it seems to be. The way it's been described to me is that if you repeat expose your immune system to a particular antigen, a high dose of an antigen through injection, it doesn't come through natural mucosal immunity, but it bypasses this, that your immune system learns to ignore it. And so you can end up having spike protein floating around your system for longer. And spike protein is, there's all types of spikopathy that people speak about, that there's amyloidogenic properties of this, where it can trigger amyloids. There's some clotting artifacts. There's some inflammation artifacts. So the concern is that if your immune system gets tuned off on this thing, what implication does it have for autoimmune disease? What does it have for cancer? And those are important questions. The thing about the vaccines is it's very hard to pin down. What is causing all of these side effects. I've heard there's a lot of compelling theories out there. I like the simplest one that I like is from Mark Giardo, which just speaks about when you inject these lipid nanoparticles, they effectively are going to get into your circulatory system and start transfecting your epithelial cells and target them for destruction by the immune system, because your cells will take up the spike, express it, the spike gets to the cell membrane, and then your immune system goes to town and starts destroying parts of your epithelial lining. And that alone leads to all types of leaky problems. If your epithelial cells are leaking, you can get sepsis, you can get MS, you can get, if it hits your blood-brain barrier, all types of problems. And this is why some of the really wide variety of manifestations of vaccine harm are so, in fact, vague. They're hard to pin down. You see them manifest in very different organ systems. And then, of course, there's a tremendous amount of literature about the spike protein itself being a problem. That when it's expressed in the heart, all these tissues that have myocarditis tend to have spike protein, and there's debate back and forth on whether there's enough of the spike protein to really be a problem, and whether it's just a tracer molecule for where these lipid nanoparticles went and did damage and triggered your immune system to attack certain cells in your body, and the spike just happens to be there, or is it actually part of the problem? I think a little bit of both is probably going on from everything I've read, but I don't think we could ignore the mode of injection here is something that needs to be revisited. We never really got good vehicle controls in the vaccines where they just inject lipid nanoparticles and see what the hell happens. That would be important to know, because they plan on using this platform for another 100 vaccines that are in the pipeline, like RSV and everything else. So if the actual carrier is a problem through injection, then and I think Mark's concern was that even nurses who are skilled at doing these injections, and if they aspirate, which most aren't aspirating, even then they still get 1% to 2% intravascular injection. And even if it's in the muscle, eventually it's going to leak to the circulatory system. So that delivery mechanism isn't necessarily going to give you mucosal immunity in your nasal passage, right? It's getting immune systems to be aware of this thing when it's systemic, but it's not. Where you really want immunity is in your nasal pharyngeal cavity, on your mucosa and in your lungs, which injections don't necessarily provide. So I think that the whole route of delivery is something that needs to be questioned. Like, what I worry about is they're going to say, okay, let's say you guys don't like spike, let's move it to nucleocapsid or something else. Do all these problems go away?
So
I don't know if they do.
so for people like listening though, like what should they really be concerned about, or what would you be looking for? If you had, repeated injections, say you got, your 2 doses and then you got a couple boosters, like, is there something that you would be more concerned about than something else?
Well, we have to be realistic on the number of people that have gotten these injections is in the billions, right? So they're not all dying, right? So we don't want to become the kind of COVID fear porn that happened on the virus, that there's a lot of people that have had these and have nothing to worry about. So I don't want to spread fear around that, but there are a few people that have.
Yeah, most people who get the vaccine don't have side effects. Like most people,
right. There's a subset that do,
because there's been billions and billions of doses given.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Yeah. So, but for the subset that do, if you had an adverse event, I'd advise to step back from these things, because your body's not responding well to it, and we don't know why. And you probably don't need it anymore, because COVID's everywhere. The immunity levels are like north of 90% in most places when they look at antibody studies. So it's attenuated now with Omicron, and your body already has some natural immunity to it. So the vaccines aren't going to help you at all from that regard.
Yeah, I don't want to create any more fear either. Like, I think if you've gotten it and you don't feel any side effects from it,
Live your life.
Live your life and don't worry about it. If you did get a side effect from it, then maybe hold off on getting the next vaccine, or at least chat with your doctor about it. Let them know that you had a bad reaction and you don't really feel comfortable getting another one, and get their advice. I agree with we don't need to go the opposite way with just like people were scared of the virus, like you said. We don't need people now to be scared of what's going to happen because they got the vaccine 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think the Schmeling paper is a good one to look at for some people to understand this. There's a couple things we have to tease apart. There are genetics that might be predisposed to adverse reactions to this, and we haven't sorted those out. And then we also know that on the manufacturing side, the lots vary tremendously. Schmeling put up this paper showing adverse events by lot, and it's very correlative to what lot you have. So if it's a bit of a Russian roulette on the lot right now. So the manufacturing needs to be tightened up. They don't have. I think the EUA has done a lot of damage there. It's meant that they can get away with putting things to market that haven't been thoroughly tested and aren't heavily vetted. And so there's that variable out there that if you get a bad lot, it doesn't matter what your genetics are. You might just be in for a bad ride. And so those are things that folks need to be aware of. Now, I'm not a treating physician, so I can't advise on what to do if you've actually been hit with one of these things, other than to follow, like the FLCCC seems to have really good content on what to do about clearing this, and there's other physicians online that have more experience with how to treat long COVID and long vax.
I appreciate your opinion on the vax. I know we only have about 10 or 15 minutes here left, Kevin, and there was just one other subject that I wanted to touch on. So the other subject I wanted to touch on was psilocybin or magic mushrooms, because I know this is a subject that quite a bit about as well. And there's been some interesting research that's come out over the past couple of years We had our first kind of head-to-head trial with psilocybin versus escitalopram in the New England Journal of Medicine, where it showed that psilocybin was just as effective. Although if you look at it very, very closely, I think there was a little bit more of an improvement in the psilocybin group. I don't think it was statistically significant is what they put it, but I think there was a little bit more of an improvement there. And then the other thing about that study that I like to bring up too is that, escitalopram is not really a standard antidepressant. And what I mean by that is that they've kind of shown that that is more or less the most effective one. So when they've looked at escitalopram versus other SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, it's actually shown that in a couple different studies that that escitalopram is most effective overall. So, if they had, say, done a study on psilocybin versus another antidepressant, say like Prozac or fluoxetine is Prozac, you may have had different results and it may have reached statistical significance. Whereas, because they compared it to Cipralex, they didn't quite reach it. Again, I'm just kind of speculating. Right. It's just a hypothesis, but I think that could have happened. But overall, what did you think of that study, and what are your thoughts on psilocybin going forward?
Well, it's another compound where the therapeutic index is off the charts, right? We don't see overdoses with this drug, and I'm not aware of many cases. Granted, it being illegal, we don't have good transparency on this particular fact, but we do know there's labels on a lot of these SSRIs for suicidal ideation, and I've not seen that in the anecdotal folklore of psilocybin that this has suicidal ideations linked with it.
I think what happens there, not to interrupt, Kevin, is that the theory there, and this is what I learned in medical school and what some people think, is that people are so depressed that they won't do anything to initiate the act of committing suicide. Because if you commit suicide, you have to initiate that. You have to find a way to do it. You have to make a plan and that kind of thing. And so what they think is that initially, if they start to get better, they get better to a point where they're good enough to commit the act, but they're not actually good enough to bring themselves out of depression. I'm not sure whether or not that theory is true. That's what's been taught to me again in school, and I've had other physicians kind of indicate that to me as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. What I found fascinating about the studies I've seen on psilocybin is that they tend to only need like 3 or 4 of these monitored therapeutic sessions. I think Johns Hopkins has been doing a lot of this work, and they have something like over a 70% conversion rate where they get them out of depression and it's like done. It's not like they're on cannabinoids the rest of their life or on some other drug the rest of their life. It's like 3 treatments and things are resolved, and that's remarkable for that particular form of depression.
And these are with macro doses.
They are. They're like heroic journeys that they go with. They have a guided, I think, therapist there with them for this. And this is how Oregon has actually rolled it out. It's not legal like a dispensary with cannabis yet. It's in a very controlled setting where you have therapists that are present during a guided trip, if you will, like that. And I think they're expanding it to PTSD and a variety of other conditions. So there's a lot of promise there that I think from a toxicology standpoint, I like the direction it's going. It's something that has a really impressive therapeutic index. It's a compound that's been around for a very long time. It's got a lot of human dose hours on it, despite it's not necessarily studied in a randomized controlled trial. They're starting to do this, but it's not studied perhaps like the other SSRIs. So there's, I think.
And overall, you think there's more research and more benefit maybe to macrodosing than microdosing. I know I haven't listened to it yet, but I know when Andrew Huberman did his podcast with Robin Carhart-Harris, which I'll probably listen to this weekend, he indicated in there that he believed there was more evidence for macrodosing than there was for microdosing. But that just maybe because, we don't have enough studies on microdosing.
That's my thinking too, is that they're going after the hardest cases, which are like these drug-resistant forms of depression that aren't responding to anything else, and those might require that. But there's probably a long tail of depression of people who aren't as severely depressed and might benefit from just microdosing. They are trying to. I know of some folks in that space that are trying to tease apart the receptor biology for what's responsible for these full-on psychedelic effects through serotonin 5-HT2A or whatever, and because these molecules aren't very specific to one serotonin receptor, they do go off target to other serotonin receptors. fact, there's some, I think, in your heart that folks are worried about with prolonged usage of psilocybin, that it could affect some valves in your heart, because I think it's 1A. It may have some off-target effects on. But they're trying to build derivatives of these compounds that will deliver you the therapeutic effect without necessarily this heroic trip. And there's some controversy over this. Some people believe that might be what's needed to work out some of these really deep-seated traumas, is that you might actually need that ego dissolution for this to work. But
That would make sense to me,
yeah,
but
we have to see.
we'll see what
They've got to
happens.
build these compounds and see what they do, and maybe there's a way to achieve this without having so much, such a psychedelic experience that you have to be kind of locked in a cabin while it happens.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously it can be, very, very unpleasant to have, ego dissolution to say the least. But again, like I'm not sure. We'll have to find out in the studies whether or not it's necessary. I mean, my thinking is that it probably is, and I don't know if they're going to be able to make any compounds that are going to be as effective as psilocybin is. I just think that like that is part of the therapeutic effect, but we'll have to see in these studies. But very interesting. I think that we need to do a little bit more research on that. And coming back to the microdosing for a sec, Kevin, I know a lot of people are using other compounds when they're microdosing. I mean, Paul Stamets has really popularized this NLP protocol where he has niacin and lion's mane added to psilocybin. But I did see a study, I'm sure you saw, I think it was out last year or the year before, that indicated that there was no difference between people who took psilocybin versus people who took psilocybin plus niacin and lion's mane. Now, that being said, I do think lion's mane has a tremendous amount of research and there's a great benefit for it. But it was interesting to see that study, and I was kind of surprised to see that there wasn't any difference between the psilocybin group versus the psilocybin plus niacin and lion's mane group.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know a few folks that were taking niacin for COVID, and a few of them would report like a flushing reaction that was really unpleasant if you
Yeah,
take too much of it. So I wonder if that's playing a
I
role.
like the
Yeah,
flush.
it freaks some people out. So yeah.
I take it and get into the sauna. I like the
Oh, nice.
flush,
Yeah.
but I'm a bit of a freak. So a lot of people just don't like it. I mean, I can understand it makes you feel super, super tingly, but it kind of feels a little bit like beta alanine, which is what some people use to enhance their endurance. It's in a lot of like
Oh,
pre-workout
interesting.
products. It kind of feels a little bit like that, but I think niacin is probably a little bit stronger depending on the dose that you use.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder if that. I don't know how that plays a role with delivery of psilocybin, and whether that's if it gets a different biodistribution when you have that present. Who knows?
Yeah, very, very interesting. Do you think there's any other compounds that would go well with psilocybin, or do you think like psilocybin on its own is kind of
Well,
the way to go if you are going to
I think we're in the
microdose?
stage where we were with cannabis, where we thought all the magic was from THC, and if you dig into these mushrooms, you find out they actually make like 6 different tryptamines that are really interesting. There's obviously there's psilocybin and psilocin, but there's also baeocystin and norbaeocystin, originacin, and they're starting to find that the blooming reaction in the mushrooms actually, the psilocybin actually turning into an oligomer. It's like polymerizing from it. There's a gene called PSIL that polymerizes psilocybin, and we don't know how active that is, but when you see mushrooms that get blued from bruising, it's actually psilocybin getting chained together. It probably has less psilocybin active for psychedelic experience, but it turns it into something else that we now need to know. The other thing they make in the mycelium is they make all of these beta carbolines, which are like harmine. These are things that slow.
And Kevin, sorry to interrupt there, but you said mycelium, and I think this is an important point because there's a lot of products that are sold online, like fruiting bodies. So
Yes,
we'll sell like the fruiting bodies, and those are not going to have the same similar
they
effects
won't.
as
No,
mycelium
no. The
products.
mice. In
Okay.
fact, I think it was Hofmeister who demonstrated that the beta carbolines are mostly in the mycelium and not in the fruiting body. It's like 100-fold difference or something. And most people aren't
Okay.
consuming those. But to the extent that they do get some of it by accident, perhaps in the way that they're harvesting these things, the mycelium contains these monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and so they slow down the metabolism of these things. This is how ayahuasca works: is you have to actually deliver DMT and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor so that it can get through your GI without destruction. Uh,
Which is insane how they
I don't
figured
know how
that
they
out
figured that
like
out. It's got
thousands
to
of
be
years
aliens or
ago. Like,
Egyptians or something.
it's crazy. Like I don't know how they figured
There
that
must be a
out
lot
in
of
the
dead people
Amazon
trying
thousands of years
mixing two
ago.
different plants together, right? I mean, it's amazing. They
It is
sorted that out.
amazing.
But the mushrooms figured out how to do it itself, at least from its own genome. But we're not necessarily focused on the mycelium. Most people are eating the fruiting bodies, and so they're probably not getting a lot of
So
this.
if you're looking for adaptogenic mushrooms like lion's mane and cordyceps and reishi and all these others, make sure that you're getting a product that has mycelium and not the
Yeah,
fruiting
well, I don't
bodies.
even know what those
Yeah.
things synthesize in their mycelium. I just know that from Hofmeister's work, he saw the beta carbolene expression was in the mycelium predominantly. So at least for psilocybe cubensis, that was where they're getting expressed. It could be completely different in another mushroom, but they do. You know, the lion's mane genome was recently sequenced, so we'll at least know if those genes are in there. I haven't gone looking, but as they sequence each of these mushrooms, they begin to understand which pathways are present and what they're capable of making, and then it's just a question of finding the right culturing conditions to bring them out.
Amazing. So Kevin, I know we're just out of time there now. It's been amazing, chatting with you. It was too long in between last episode and this one, so I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen
Oh,
next
indeed.
time. Um, but where can people find you on Twitter? Where can they find you online, and where can they learn more about you and your
Okay,
work?
Kevin underscore McKernan. You'll find me at on Twitter. I have a Substack. That's the Nepentolactone newsletter. That's catnip, actually. If you know what catnip is, it's Nepentolactone. So you can Google and find that. And then I work at Medicinal Genomics, where we build a lot of genomic tools for monitoring psilocybin and cannabis. So you can those three places are probably the best source. And I'll try and get you guys
Awesome.
links to the CanMed videos too, because I think Bonnie has some great stuff on CBG and psoriasis and cancer, and it's more than just an anti-inflammatory. It's playing a role in or outside of anxiety.
Yeah, I'd love to hear, that talk, or at least a little bit more about how, it's 10 times potentially more anxiolytic than CBD, because, that's just incredible. But Kevin, you have so much knowledge. I don't even know how to keep it in your head sometimes when I'm talking to you. It's kind of crazy. But
Kind of you to
thank you
say,
so
but
much again for doing this. I really do appreciate it. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And as always, I'll be back again soon.
excellent. Thanks, Mike.